Let's look at the exterior landmarks. We have four main exterior landmarks that we have to know. There are others here, but we're going to focus on these four. And they're all connected in some way to the temporal bone. We have the mastoid process, that is that large lump of bone. If you feel behind your own ear, you'll feel a very large lump of bone. That is where the various muscles attach. It is actually hollow with a big sinus, so it's not that heavy on the skull, but it is strong for muscle attachment. Anterior and slightly superior is the external auditory meatus. I know the word looks like it should be meatus, but they pronounce all three syllables, meatus. The external auditory meatus is your ear canal on the outside. Then deep to both of these, we have a styloid process. As if there weren't enough styloid processes on the radius and the ulna, we also have a styloid process on the skull. This is deep so that you cannot feel it on your own skull, but small muscles that are for chewing attach there. And finally, the zygomatic arch. Now, the book talks about the zygomatic process and the temporal process. We're going to do the whole zygomatic arch. It comes from the zygomatic bone and attaches to the temporal bone. So it crosses these two bones and it makes that arch that is part of your cheekbone. If the cheekbone is broken, that zygomatic arch is frequently snapped, cracked, or crushed. Looking on the inside of the skull, the internal landmarks, we start with the fossa. We have the anterior cranial fossa, the middle cranial fossa, and the posterior cranial fossa. The key is it is middle, not medial. It's not in the center line of the skull. It's between anterior and posterior. We frequently refer to landmarks as being, or for the foramina, as being in which cranial fossa. In the anterior cranial fossa, we have the cribriform plate, which is the space around the superior portion of the ethmoid bone on that top middle piece. And in the center of the cribriform plate in the middle of the ethmoid bone is this crista galli, which means the chicken's head I mentioned in class. That is the anchor point for the meninges of your brain. The other really solid landmark you have to know is this point here in the middle of the sphenoid bone. It is called the sella turcica. The name means the Turk saddle. Somebody thought it looked like a camel saddle. That is where your pituitary gland goes. So you have to know that the pituitary gland fits into the sella turcica. I pointed out on this photograph the petrous portion of the temporal bone. This is where we house the middle ear. This is mostly for a reference point. So if I say, for instance, the internal foramina is in the petrous portion, you know where the petrous portion is. But the crista galli and the sella turcica are testable points. Let's look at the foramina, the holes of the internal cranium. Not all of them have the name foramen, but they all have holes. So the ones on this photograph match up with the drawing in the lab book on page 163. We start with the olfactory foramina. Olfactory means smell. They are in the cribriform plate. So that is the olfactory foramina. We always start anterior, move posterior. We have the optic canals, which are here right at the top of the sella turcica. That's for the optic nerve. We can't actually truly see the superior orbital fissure from a photograph like this. That's because it is deep under the ledge of this part of the sphenoid bone. If I were to draw it in, and it is drawn in the artwork, it would be a long slash of a hole. It's called a fissure because it's wider than just a hole. It's wider than just a foramen, so we call it a fissure. It is deep under that ledge. Coming posterior to that, we have the foramen rotundum. Foramen rotundum means the round hole. And we have the foramen ovale, which means the oval hole. Then in the petrous portion, we have the internal auditory meatus. That's these little holes. It doesn't actually go all the way through. The external auditory meatus ends at the eardrum. And then you have the middle ear space, and then you have the internal ear. The internal auditory meatus carries nerves to the internal ear and stops. At the base of the petrous portion, at the beginning of the posterior cranial fossa, you have the jugular foramen. It is the connection point between the temporal bone and the occipital bone. Yes, the jugular vein goes through there, as well as a few nerves. And then in the wall of the foramen magnum, which is in the next slide, there are two little tiny holes right here in the wall that I'm now putting in with red dots. Those are the hypoglossal canals. If I think about the ones that do not have cranial nerves, we have this little tiny hole called the foramen spinosum. It's right, both lateral and posterior to the foramen ovale. It is for a small artery to the brain. We all like small arteries to the brain. Medial is the foramen lacerum. Now, the foramen lacerum is actually the meeting point of the sphenoid, the temporal, and the occipital bone. So it's just a space that never got filled in. In the body, in life, it has a membrane covering it. Nothing actually goes through the foramen lacerum. But if you look just lateral and posterior to it, you can see this dark channel here that I've just circled. It is medial and distal to the spinosum as well. That is where the carotid canal from the underside of the skull connects to come up. You can't see the actual carotid canal from this side. It doesn't go straight through. The carotid canal actually goes into the temporal bone and does an S-shaped turn. But it's right next to the foramen lacerum. And of course, finally, we have the foramen magnum. Foramen magnum means the really big hole. This one is the one for the spinal cord.